Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I appreciate so very much you being with me. Do me a huge favor. Would you please hit the subscribe button, the like button, the share button? Okay? I think they're separate buttons, right? Okay, please do that for me. The channel continues to grow. I appreciate that so very much. And so I just ask you to help me continue to grow on this channel so that more and more people can understand the power, the glory of fulfilled eschatology. Okay, so yesterday we looked at, in our continuing study of the feast days of Israel, specifically Sukkot, as it relates to the coming of the Lord, judgment, resurrection, and the time of the end of the charismatic gifts. Because the end of the age, coming of the Lord, are all historically related to the end of the charismata. Now, as I've suggested to you, it's really strange to me and revealing, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but it's really strange to me that by far, the dominant definition of that which is perfect is the coming of the Lord, the new creation at the coming of the Lord, etc. But now there are many preterists, those who believe the Lord came in AD 70. They now say, well, yeah, we used to believe that the charismatic gifts would end at the day of the Lord, but we don't believe that anymore. The charismatic gifts were not to end at the day of the Lord. Well, that's quite a twist. That's quite a new argument. Can it be sustained? I don't believe so. I don't believe it can be sustained at all. And so what I'm doing is looking in depth at 1 Corinthians chapter 13, where Paul says, where there be knowledge, it shall fail. Where there be tongues, they shall cease. Where there be prophecies, they shall fail. Just a really quick digression. I had somebody tell me not too long ago as we were discussing these things, well, you're telling me that the miracles have ended. Paul said, when that which is perfect is come, knowledge would cease. But we still have knowledge. You claim to have knowledge. And I said, well, let's think about this for a minute. You're telling me that miracles would end when the Lord comes, right? Absolutely. I said, well, okay, then when the Lord comes, does all knowledge end? And I mean, to try to be facetious here, their face fell off. Because they realized if they were using the word knowledge to refer to normal knowledge, normal human knowledge, then when they would say, and when they were saying, well, that which is perfect arrives at the day of the Lord, that means knowledge ends at the day of the Lord. Therefore, when the Lord comes, we don't know anything whatsoever. And they very quickly saw the fallacy of that argument. No, the knowledge and the prophecy and the tongues were part and parcel of the body of charismatic gifts, the miraculous gifts. So it is a prediction of the cessation of the miraculous. And once again, it would be when that which is perfect is come. Now, yesterday, I shared with you the three dominant views that have been proposed historically to identify that which is perfect, or the face to face. I closed yesterday with saying, whatever that which is perfect is or was, it was without any doubt to be the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Now, this reality brings this entire subject under the microscope. not one of the traditional views, in their attempt to identify and define that which is perfect, not one of them focuses on the cessation of the charismata as in any way at all related to the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Now remember, that technically goes all the way back to the garden. I'm just focusing on how the promise of the garden became the focus of the Abrahamic promise, and then defined and refined even more into the hope of Israel. That doesn't mean it was no longer the hope of Abraham, doesn't mean it was no longer the hope of Adam and Eve. It means it was being refined and defined and explicated in the Tanakh, in the hope of Israel. So why do I say that whatever that which is perfect was or is, and whatever the face to face was or is, that it had to be the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel? Why do I say that? Well, I'm not just pulling it out of the air. I didn't invent it. But here's the fact. Paul said his doctrine of the resurrection. Well, resurrection is the fulfillment of Sukkot. Sukkot is at the end of the age, at the coming of the Lord, the time of the cessation of the miracles. And thus, to say that Paul was looking for that which is perfect is to say he was looking for the hope of Israel to be fulfilled. That means that he was saying that his anticipation of the face-to-face was to be the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. In other words, folks, when Bible commentators tell us that which is perfect comes at the end of the current Christian age, that is a completely anachronistic type of interpretation of 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Paul was not looking for the end of the Christian age in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Why do I know that? How do I know that? I know that because guess what? The Christian age has no end. To put that in a different way, the new covenant age has no end. To put it another way, the Messianic age has no end. Isaiah is quite clear about this. Isaiah chapter 9, 6 and following. Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. I was in a debate one time, and I made this very point because my opponent, Dr. David Hester from Montgomery, Alabama, Faulkner University there, he was arguing that we're looking for the end of the Christian age. And I got up and I had charts with numerous texts on it which affirm that the rule, the reign, the kingdom of Christ, which is inclusive of evangelism, has no end. And I'll never forget, as I made that point, folks, what does no end mean? And there were just person after person in the audience that would just turn to one another and going, wow. Listen, if you posit the end of the charismata at the end of the Christian age, the end of the current age, then you are making a completely anachronistic argument. You are making a completely untenable argument. You are positing the end of something that the Bible affirms has no end. I mean, it's really honestly that simple. The only age, scripturally, the only age that was to ever end, at the day of the Lord, by the way, was the Old Covenant age, the age of Moses, the law, and the prophets, the age that foretold its own demise. And that was the age of Moses, the law, and the prophets. So Paul said that he taught no other thing than what Moses, the law, and the prophets said was to happen. Acts 26:21 and following, Acts 24:14 and following. And I've had people say, well, yeah, Paul's doctrine of the resurrection was certainly from the Old Testament, but that doesn't mean that his doctrine of that which is perfect was related to the end of the Old Covenant age. Well, let me reiterate something. And I know this is reiteration, but it's critical. You cannot divorce the end of the charismata from the end of the age. Because the charismata were to end at the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is the day of the harvest. The day of the harvest is the time of Sukkot. You therefore, listen to me very, very carefully. You cannot divorce the coming of that which is perfect. You cannot divorce the face-to-face from, number one, the fulfillment of Sukkot, since it would occur at the end of the age. Miracles would end at the end of the age and the coming of the Lord. So you cannot divorce the end of the miracles from Sukkot, and that means you cannot divorce, listen to me, you have to catch the power of this. You cannot divorce the end of the miracles, the age of the miracles, from the time of the consummation of God's dealings with Old Covenant Israel. I mean, after all, the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection are biblically the climax of the age. What age? The Old Covenant age, because the Christian age has no end. But the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection were all promises made to Old Covenant Israel. And Sukkot, pardon me, Sukkot is part of that warp and woof of God, of God's eschatological promises to Israel. Folks, do you catch the power of this? The end of the charismata, since it's linked to the day of the Lord, since it is linked with the resurrection, and since since the coming of the Lord, the judgment, and the resurrection are inseparably, inextricably bound up with Israel's Old Testament prophecies and promises, pardon me, that means you cannot have a doctrine that says, oh, God was through with Israel at the cross. Well, if God was through with Israel at the cross, then the resurrection, the judgment, the coming of the Lord was at the cross. Because the final 3 feast days of Israel's festal calendar foretold judgment, parousia, resurrection. So you can't have Israel's Old Covenant relationship with Yahweh ending at the cross without the fulfillment of those final 3 feast days. What did Jesus say about the law? Not one jot, not one tittle shall pass from the law. Listen to me very carefully. The law was without any doubt whatsoever the feast days. Nothing was more intrinsically, fundamentally part of the law than the feast days. Thus, you can't have the law ending at the cross, as I was raised believing and teaching, without saying judgment, parousia, resurrection occurred at the cross, or they failed. And you cannot say judgment, parousia, resurrection are yet future without saying the old law remains completely and totally valid and binding today. This is why I say, when we come to 1 Corinthians 13, and Paul said he was looking for that which is perfect, and he was looking for the face to face. He was looking for the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. So that brings up the issue, where in the Tanakh did God predict the arrival of that which is perfect? Where in the Tanakh did God promise the arrival of the face to face? We'll talk about that tomorrow. See you there.